We offer you deep historical information from history on YouTube channel. Subscribe. Now don't forget to turn on notifications.
The Vietnam War was a complex and fascinating period of conflict that took place between 1955 and 1975. It was a conflict with political, military and social consequences, involving many international actors and complex dynamics. Here is a detailed account of the Vietnam War. 1. Background and causes. The origins of the Vietnam War date back to the early 20th century. The French colonial presence in Vietnam clashed with Vietnamese demands for independence. The Japanese occupation of Vietnam during the Second World War led to a decline in French influence. However, with the end of the war, the French attempted to reassert control in Vietnam. With the rise of nationalist sentiment in Vietnam and the spread of communist ideals, the Viet Minh movement, led by Ho Chi Minh, began to fight against the French. These conflicts led to the Franco-Vietnamese War, which began in 1946 and culminated in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The defeat at Dien Bien Phu ended French sovereignty in Vietnam, and the Geneva Conference recognized communist control in the north of Vietnam and a French-backed government in the south. 2. Cold War context. The Vietnam War can also be seen as part of the Cold War. Communist powers such as the Soviet Union and China supported North Vietnam, while the United States and other Western allies supported South Vietnam. According to the domino theory, the US believed that it had to support South Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. 3. US involvement. From the late 1950s, US involvement in Vietnam increased. Initially, military advisors and aid were sent to support the South Vietnamese government. By the mid-1960s, however, it had become a major military conflict in which the US was involved. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 justified further US involvement in the war and led Congress to pass the Tonkin Resolution, which authorized the US president to intervene militarily in the war. 4. Military strategies and conflicts. The Vietnam War was characterized by the use of a variety of military strategies. It was a war in which the US faced complex counterinsurgency and asymmetric warfare strategies rather than conventional combat tactics. Instead of fighting on a traditional front, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army fought US and South Vietnamese forces using more flexible and surprising strategies such as ambushes, tunnels, and guerrilla tactics. The intensity and complexity of the conflict led to a number of major conflicts and battles. Conflicts such as the Tet Offensive, 1968, the Battle of Khe Sanh, and the Battle of Hamburger Hill were among the major events that influenced the course of the war. Overall, however, despite US technological superiority, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces challenged the US both militarily and politically. 5. Social movements and protests. The Vietnam War led to deep divisions and social movements in the US. Anti-war protests were widespread, particularly among young people and university students. These protests strongly challenged the legitimacy of the Vietnam War and US involvement in the war. The escalating costs and casualties of the war created a deep debate in the US public and political arena. The failure to end the war over the years and the deaths and injuries of American soldiers eroded public support for the war. 6. Consequences and legacies. The aftermath of the Vietnam War is complex and has long-lasting effects. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords officially ended the war and US troops withdrew. However, in 1975, North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam to form a united Vietnam, ending the war with a communist victory. The legacy of the war traumatized American public opinion and had a profound impact on military strategies, foreign policy approaches, and anti-war movements. Considered a turning point in understanding the true costs and complexities of war, the Vietnam War continues to be debated and studied. 1. The Franco-Vietnam War and the Geneva Conference. Let us focus on the end of the French presence in Vietnam and the results of the Geneva Conference. This conference agreed on a temporary division between the north and south of Vietnam. Elections for the unification of Vietnam were also planned for 1956, but did not take place. 2. Political unrest in South Vietnam. In South Vietnam, we should focus on the instability of the US-backed administration. The authoritarian rule of No Dinh Diem failed in the fight against Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong and increased political and social discontent in South Vietnam. 3. US involvement and the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Let us focus on the escalation of US involvement in Vietnam and the acceleration of US military intervention following the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This event led to the US adopting the Tonkin Resolution and becoming militarily involved in the war. 4. Military strategies and tactics. Let's take a closer look at the tactics and strategies used by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces. In particular, how tactics such as guerrilla warfare, tunnel networks, and village-to-village warfare were used. 5. The Tet Offensive and other major conflicts. Let's look in more detail at major battles such as the Tet Offensive and battles such as the Battle of Khe Sanh. We will examine how these major conflicts affected the course of the war and the dynamics between the parties. 6. Social impact of the war and protests. Examine the impact of the Vietnam War on US society. Look at how anti-war protests grew into a movement, especially among young people and university students. 7. Aftermath and deepening legacy. Let us take a closer look at the aftermath and legacy of the Vietnam War. In particular, let us examine the long-term effects of the war on US foreign policy, military strategies, and the social fabric. Let us also examine the war's impact on Vietnam and try to understand how Vietnam has been shaped today. By delving into these details, we can gain a more complete understanding of the Vietnam War. 8. Civilian casualties and crimes against humanity. The Vietnam War caused civilian casualties as well as military casualties. Various aspects of the war, such as bombing, village massacres, and the use of chemical agents, affected the civilian population. In particular, the use of Agent Orange by the US and the contamination of the land led to long-term health problems that are still being felt today. 9. International dimension and Cold War context. The Vietnam War took place during the Cold War and should be seen in the context of US policy to stop the spread of communism. Communist powers such as the Soviet Union and China supported North Vietnam, while the United States and its Western allies supported South Vietnam. This added to the international dimension of the war. 10. Long-term impact and legacy. The long-term effects of the Vietnam War were profound, both in Vietnam and in the United States. In Vietnam, the devastating effects of the war and the scars it left on the social fabric were felt for many years. In the US, the trauma of the war and the strengthening of social movements had a profound impact on foreign policy and military strategy. In addition, the impact of the Vietnam War on US society led to the rise of anti-war movements and increased social activism in the post-war period. 11. Diplomatic achievements and reintegration. After the end of the Vietnam War, Vietnam's reintegration and its role in international affairs gained importance. Vietnam moved away from its communist ideology and embraced economic reform and opening up. In addition, the process of normalizing diplomatic relations with the United States became an important agenda item in the post-war period. 12. Historical memory and commemoration. Historical memory and commemoration of the Vietnam War play an important role in preserving and transmitting the legacy of the war to future generations. Through memorials, museums, books and films, the historical and social significance of the war is continually reassessed and commemorated. These commemorations are important for understanding and passing on the impact of the war to future generations. 13. The economic impact of the war. The Vietnam War had a huge impact not only on human lives but also on the economy. The cost of the war to the US was high, and the long-term effects of the war on the US economy were evident. The Vietnamese economy was also severely affected by the devastating effects of the war. 14. Psychological effects of the war. The Vietnam War had a profound psychological impact on the soldiers involved. The violence of war, traumatic events, and adjustment problems after returning home affected the lives of many soldiers in the post-war period. Participants in anti-war movements and victims of the war also needed psychological support. 15. Cultural and artistic reflections. The Vietnam War was reflected in many forms of art, from literature to cinema, music to painting. The war influenced the themes and narratives of many works and left its mark on the work of many artists in the post-war period. These artistic reflections have contributed to efforts to understand the profound effects of war and the human experience. 16. The environmental impact of war. The Vietnam War also had a serious impact on the environment. In particular, the use of chemicals such as Agent Orange led to the contamination of agricultural land and water resources and caused serious disruptions to the ecological balance. These environmental impacts affected Vietnam's ecological balance for many years to come. 17. Impact of the war on education and research. The Vietnam War also had a significant impact on education and research. In particular, the political, military and social dimensions of the war have been an important subject of academic study and research. The study of the Vietnam War has stimulated in-depth studies in various disciplines. This broad examination of the Vietnam War helps us to better understand the complexity of the war and its profound effects. Within this framework, a comprehensive examination of the various aspects of the war helps us to understand its legacy and significance. The legacy of the Vietnam War has left a deep mark not only on the pages of history, but also on human memory. The war had long-lasting effects not only militarily, but also politically, socially, economically, and culturally. But the legacy of the Vietnam War is not only one of suffering and destruction, but also of human endurance, resilience, and hope. This war showed the resilience of humanity and its ability to unite in the face of adversity. The suffering and struggles of people have come together in the post-war period to choose peace, forgiveness, and reconstruction. The legacy of the Vietnam War is remarkable in that it reminds future generations of the importance of peace and the importance of hope, despite the challenges humanity faces. It reminds us of the power of humanity to work together and stand together for a better future.
We offer you deep historical information from history on YouTube channel. Subscribe. Now don't forget to turn on notifications.